During his rule, King Remils the Third was, to put it mildly, a vast disappointment. His girth was legendary, a mountainous landscape of flesh that strained the seams of his royal robes. He waddled more than walked, and his breath came in wheezy puffs, like a disgruntled bellows. But his physical size was only half the problem. Remils was also remarkably, almost creatively rude. He viewed his subjects with a disdain that was palpable. The farmers, whose sweat and toil fed his gargantuan appetite, were ungrateful peasants. The merchants, who diligently brought him silks and spices, were greed-soaked vultures. And the court, comprised of advisors desperately trying to keep the kingdom from crumbling under his rule, were witless sheep. His days were a monotonous cycle of gorging himself on mountains of roasted meats, rich pastries, and oceans of wine, interspersed with bouts of belittling his staff and issuing ridiculous decrees. He'd once declared that all swans had to wear tiny, bespoke hats, simply because a court jester had dared to suggest that they looked silly. No one dared to argue. The kingdom, once vibrant and prosperous, began to wither under Rimels's rule. The people spoke in hushed tones, their joy replaced with a pervasive fear of attracting his ire. Even the royal hounds, normally a boisterous pack, whimpered and hid when they saw him lumbering towards them. One particularly opulent feast was underway. The tables sagged under the weight of the food, whole roasted boars, pyramids of glazed fruit, mountains of bread, and a river of wine. Remils, seated on his enormous throne, which had to be specially reinforced, was in his element. Grease glistened on his chin as he tore into a leg of mutton. His voice, thick with food, boomed across the hall. "More wine," he bellowed, snapping his fingers at a quivering servant. "And bring me more of those sugared plums. These are hardly enough to sustain a fledgling sparrow, let alone a king." A gasp went through the room. The king had just insulted the head chef's new masterpiece. The poor man's face crumpled, and he retreated to the kitchen, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The feast continued, each bite and each insult delivered with equal relish by Remils. He didn't notice the way his face was growing red, nor the way his breathing was becoming increasingly ragged. He was too consumed by his own gluttony and his own perceived importance. Then, mid-sentence, as he was berating the royal astrologer for not predicting the deliciousness of a particular pie, Remils clutched at his chest. His eyes widened in surprise, and a strangled sound escaped his lips. He looked around, his face contorted in confusion. Then, with a final suffocating gasp, he slumped forward onto the table, scattering and launching goblets and pastries like an exploding fortress. Silence descended upon the great hall. For a moment, the court was frozen in shock. Then a whisper rippled through the room, followed by another and another, until the whisper became a murmur of disbelief. King Remils the Third, the obese, rude tyrant, was dead. A collective sigh of relief, almost imperceptible, seemed to wash over the hall. There were no tears, no lamentations, only a strange, quiet sense of liberation. The reign of the gluttonous king was over. The kingdom, battered and bruised, finally had a chance to breathe. Remils's death, while not tragic, served as a grim reminder. His immense size, fueled by greed and indulgence, had ultimately been his downfall. And perhaps it was a lesson, however tardy, to the kingdom that true strength lies not in the girth of the body or the harshness of the tongue, but in the compassion and kindness of the heart. The kingdom had a long road ahead, but at least now the road was paved with hope rather than the tyranny of a self-consumed, obese king.